If you are listening to this recording, first allow me to thank you for being willing to play a game that my grandfather shared with me many years ago. I do not know why I am doing this, but I feel a strong urge to share this game with the world. To help you decide whether or not this is a game you truly want to play, I think I will read to you the letter that my grandfather himself wrote that helps explain the history of the game you're about to play. His story goes like this. I must have been around the age of 12 when it happened, but the memory of that day is still sketched in my mind. Even now I can hear his cries. There was a family in our town, a very peculiar family. Often, we could hear the parents shouting from their large home as we played out in the streets. We did well to mind our own as we had been warned many times by our parents. However, we would often hear our parents discussing the troubled Wilts, as they had come to call them. The Wilts were very wealthy from what we could tell. Whenever they were seen out and about, they would be dressed in the finest garments, and they held their heads tilted backward, too bothered to give any passerbys a single glance. They had one child, a son named William. One day all of the arguing must have become too much to bear for Mr. Wilt, for he came storming from the home, his wife being dragged about as she clung to his leg with tears streaming down her face. It was a tragic sight. The whole town must have been on the street that morning. One could surmise this did little to console Mrs. Wilt, but then again, one cannot be sure she even noticed. I say this because she stood so suddenly as Mr. Wilt's car hummed and screeched down the road, barely missing a crowd of onlookers as it sped by. The tears seemed to stop flowing at the silent command of Mrs. Wilt. She stood, brushed off her overcoat, turned and took long deliberate strides up the stairs leading to the large red door of the Wilts' home. All was quiet at the Wilts' home after that. Slowly the weeds began to overtake the home. Knocks at the door by concerned neighbors went unanswered. We knew they were fine though, because when the police were called by any neighbor overly concerned, the door would fling open, exposing a deep darkness that not even the day's light could seem to pierce through. The officers would converse with the figure at the door shrouded by darkness, and then turn and walk away, the door slamming before they could reach the first step. No one was at all concerned about William. He did not attend school with the rest of the children from our town anyway, and him not strolling the streets even when his parents were out and about in the past, led many to assume the Wilts had simply decided their child was better off not engaging with such common people as those in the town of Polsey. And then one day, while playing in the street, Tom threw my ball over my head and it landed on the side of the Wilts' home, and that is when I heard his voice. Barely above a whisper, a faint voice called out from the large window on the third floor of the large townhome. "Hey, you want to play a game?" the voice whispered. I heard it surprisingly clearly, but was startled nonetheless. Without hesitation, I replied, "Yes." I could see William's face hanging out of the open window above. He looked surprisingly plump and happy, not the frail and frigid boy I had imagined him to be after his many weeks of captivity. As equally quickly as I had uttered yes, a small burlap sack held by a red string began to be lowered from the window above. Tom saw what was happening and came over. Pretty soon after that, a group of 5 or more additional kids joined us under the window. William was kneeling in front of the window, his head sticking out, walking us through all the rules of the game. After many questions from the group of kids, including myself, we all finally satisfied that we understood the game. I looked up at William and asked when he would be coming outside to play. He shook his head no. "Mumsy would never let me play with you all," he said. Some in the group asked why, but we already knew. William pulled his head back inside of the home for a moment and then reappeared. "I know. I can play from here," he exclaimed excitedly. All the kids began whispering at once. No one was quite sure how that would work. Given the rules, we would be raising and lowering the sack all day long to play such a complex game. I had decided we would have to do just that. Besides, it was William's game, and he had been so nice to even share it with us. But before I could turn to tell William the good news, Tom snatched the game from my hand. I looked up at him, confused by his action. Tom leaned his head backwards and began to mimic Mr. and Mrs. Wilt's gait as he paced in a circle. "Too good to play with us," he hissed. "Well, that's just fine and dandy. We will play without him," he said before turning and running back across the street towards his house. The other kids took off after him. I turned looking back at William, and I could see the heartbreak in his eyes. I began to try to console him and let him know I would get the game back. But before I could finish, he tucked his head back into the window and disappeared. Weeks went by, and day after day I went over to the window, tossing small pebbles up into the glass, trying to get William to come back and speak with me. He never came. Tom shared the game with all the townsfolk. Before long, it was the talk of the town, each of them referring to the game as the fun little word game that the rich boy had given the children. Eventually, I gave up trying to get William to speak to me, and I too joined in on the fun of the game. One day, Tom's mum told my mum that he had fallen ill. She said it just seemed to come out of the blue, and no doctor had been able to prescribe anything that was seeming to help. Days faded by without me seeing my good friend Tom. Then my mum got the news. Tom had died. Everyone in town was heartbroken for Tom's family. Everyone gathered for the funeral. Soon after Tom's death, his mum told my mum that she and the rest of the family would be leaving as there were just too many memories in that home of young Tom. The day they were saying their goodbyes, one of the kids from the neighborhood asked Tom's parents if he could have the game that Tom had received from William. Some of the adults who gathered to see the family off shooed and shamed the child for asking about a game after all the family had gone through. However, some of the adults did not seem to mind the question and looked on anxious to hear the answer. Well, we certainly would not mind leaving it behind. But to be honest, we have not been able to find that game since Tom passed. A cold shiver went down my neck, and instantly I turned towards the Wilts' home. To this day, I could swear I saw the curtains in that third-floor window flutter a bit just as my gaze reached it. Others in the crowd looked on at Tom's family, some skeptical, others without any concern for the topic. Things, as they often did in Polsey, quickly returned to normal. As the weeks passed, the town's attention returned to the peculiar Wilt family. And then on a cold November night, it happened. I was awoken by screams and the smell of smoke in the air. Leaping from my bed to the window that faced the street, I was met by a bright orange light and bellows of black smoke pouring from the Wilt home. Amongst the crowd in the street, screaming, was a silent, motionless Mrs. Wilt. She was sitting on the curb, her hands planted firmly against the stone sidewalk, her head hanging down. Many of the men from town were carrying buckets of water up to the front door of the home, splashing it to no prevail. The flames grew brighter, and the heat coming from the home had turned this cold November night into what felt like a warm day in spring. I made my way out onto the streets. I could see my mum with her hands clasped over her mouth, and my father stumbling with a large bucket of water, spilling it as he rushed toward the Wilt home. A few women had crowded around Mrs. Wilt. They were asking her repeatedly, "Don't you care? And what's wrong with you?" Still she sat silently, her head lowered. I did not know why they were yelling at Mrs. Wilt during a time like this, but then I found why. Above all the screams in the street, I could hear what sounded like a young boy. "Mumsy! Mumsy!" the voice yelled. It was coming from the Wilt home. It was William. I had not even noticed that he was not standing out on the street. I stared at the home in complete disbelief. Eventually, the screams went quiet in the street as we all looked on. Not long after the crowd fell silent, so too did the voice that was coming from inside the Wilts home. The fire raged on for what felt like an eternity before the fire brigade were able to finally extinguish the flames. What remained was the charred framing of a dying home. I stood there staring up at that third-floor window, now just a black hole. Cops took Mrs. Wilt away that night, and none of us would ever see her again. Days passed, and for the first time that I could remember, things did not simply return to normal in Mumsy. One evening while I was sitting on the edge of my bed, thinking quietly to myself about all I had witnessed over the past several weeks, I heard a faint cry that I could not quite make out. While I could not tell what was said, I could tell exactly from where it came. I sat staring in the direction of my wardrobe. I walked over and slowly opened the door. No one was there, but just as I began to turn away, I could make out a small burlap sack tucked away in the back corner of my wardrobe. It was William's game. The townsfolk called the game a bad omen and told my parents that they should burn it, or at the very least, throw it out into the rubbish. I protested for a while, but soon told them at their behest that I would indeed get rid of it. It was creepy. I could never get over the slightly burnt smell that came from the bag and each of its many tiles within. The game disappeared that day. As far as the town and my parents knew, it was no more. However, I decided to keep it. After all, I think William really wanted me to have it. So much so that I believe he has been playing it with me ever since. I wonder if he likes the name I gave it, Mumsy. And with that, I will leave you with these parting words. Careful of the tiles, for not all messages that they share are pure.